So let's think about how do we configure private access service edges. So networking requirements need to obviously accept incoming connections. So if we're providing access over the internet, you need an inbound connection on port 443. But equally, if it's deployed inside your network, it needs to be able to have users connecting to it on TCP port 443. It needs to have a unique IP address, so as we deploy them in clusters or private service edge groups, each service edge has a unique IP address that is reachable over the transport medium that the user is connecting to, either the internal network or the internet. Additionally, then, the client connector must be able to reach the private service edge as well as the app connectors reaching the private service edge. And so for the client connector to make a decision to connect to that private service edge either needs to be the closest private service edge for that user within the geolocation. So we're doing geolocation based on the client's IP address and the IP address registered for that private service edge. Or if they're connecting over the internal network, we're using the trusted network criteria to map that private service edge to the client connector also in the same trusted network. So the deployment process for the service edge is almost identical to the way that we deploy app connectors. There'll be an intermediate certificate authority created under the enrollment certificates, which will be trusted to the same root certificate authority as the Zscaler client connector and the app connectors. So you need to create that if it doesn't already exist. Based on that intermediate certificate authority, you're going to generate a provisioning key for the private service edge. You take that provisioning key and you load it on the private service edge, and the service edge will then use that provisioning key to generate the certificate signing requests and be able to enroll with the Zero Trust Exchange. The service edge then downloads policy from the Zero Trust Exchange and functions as an extension of the Zero Trust Exchange. App connectors and client connectors can then connect to the service edge based on the geolocation or the trusted network criteria. And then the service edge validates those app connector and client connector transactions through its chain of trust to that root certificate authority that is used to issue those intermediate certificate authorities and the client certificates on the Zscaler client connector, the app connector, and the service edge. So let's walk through how that looks. We'll go into the Private Access Administration portal under the Service Edge tab, and we'll click Add Service Edge. We'll create a Service Edge group per location, and that means generating a Service Edge provisioning key for that group. And then under the Service Edge group, we'll select the Private Service Edge signing certificate that exists under the enrollment certificates. If we're going to make this Private Service Edge available over the internet, we need to select Enable for publicly accessible. We'll select the location for the trusted networks. So based on the trusted networks that are defined in the mobile portal, let's select which ones will connect to this private service edge. And if the private service edge isn't available, the client connectors will connect to the public service edges. The provisioning key is then created, and we'll deploy that provisioning key on the private service edge. So the listen IPs are the IP addresses on the private service edge that it'll listen for connections from client connectors and app connectors. By default, every available interface on the service edge is eligible for accepting connections from the client connector and the connectors. You might also configure the IP addresses or domains to publish if you're behind a firewall. So if you're doing address translation on the firewall, these IP addresses will be different. So you'd configure the NAT addresses inside this configuration option, and this will be what will be advertised out to users coming over the internet. If they're not specified, then the clients and connectors will try and connect over those listen IPs. And as I said, the publicly accessible flag is a flag that decides whether or not this private service edge is able to be accessed via its public IP address over the internet.